called him the Farmer King, but he was more than a name. He planted trees that would outlive his time. He wrote laws that would outlast his crown. He sang verses while shaping a kingdom. In an age of steel, he ruled with silence, vision, and the long patience of one who builds for tomorrow. Born in 1261 in Lisbon, son of King Afonso III, the king who studied in Bologna, where law shaped his mind and reason shaped his rule, who believed in the power of knowledge. From early on, Afonso shaped his son not for power alone, but for thought. Dom Dinis received one of the most advanced educations in medieval Europe. His tutors included Father Aymeric de Ebrard, a Frenchman versed in science, and Domingos Hardo, a theologian trained in Paris, future Bishop of Lisbon, a man of letters, and the king's own chaplain. He grew up among books, maps, and music, studied Latin, law, history, science, and song. He learned the world before ruling it. He rose to the throne in 1279. Portugal was young, unsteady, its power divided between the sword and the cross. Dom Dinis didn't raise his voice. He legislated. He created royal courts, ordered land surveys, organized the kingdom's revenues, and began shaping the machinery of the state. He issued laws on patronage and legal jurisdiction, limiting the church's control and reaffirming royal authority. The law of appeal and the law of execution ensured that justice was no longer a privilege, but a right. He revoked abusive land donations, and in 1288 decreed that anyone who found a game bird must announce it publicly, because even nature had its place in his legal code. His economic policy was also written in laws. He created tax-free fairs, strengthened foreign trade, encouraged fishing and mining, and gave Portugal its first organized network of merchants and markets. Dom Dinis was a legislator of the fields and the markets, of the forest and the cities, of the language and the realm. And in 1290, within the founding of the Studium Generale of Lisbon, he issued a royal decree: let justice be written in the language of the people. It was the people's language. Now it was the language of the law. For Dom Dinis, to rule was to shape what comes next. With words, with laws, with trees. The land was his map, and the people his purpose. He distributed land to those willing to cultivate it, founded towns, transformed crossroads into villages of trade. He gave life to the countryside, and made Portugal not just a kingdom, but a fertile field of opportunity. He wasn't only king of castles. He was king of roads, of mills, of flocks, and of bread. And as one who plants doesn't think only of today, he ordered the creation of the Leiria pine forest, an entire forest, not out of vanity, but out of vision, wood for ships that did not yet exist, shade for a future he could already foresee. Dom Dinis didn't rule only over men. He ruled over the land, over the water, over time itself, and his people saw it. That's why they called him the Farmer King. Ruling the land was no longer enough. It was time to define how far that land would go and prepare the kingdom to face the sea. To Dom Dinis, a king who left the map unfinished had failed his kingdom. He knew peace could also be a weapon of power. For years, the border between Portugal and Castile was drawn with unrest. But in 1297, the king signed the Treaty of Alcañices. For the first time, the kingdom had clear and recognized borders, and Portugal, thus outlined, gained shape and strength. It was the end of war and the beginning of a time to build. But Dom Dinis looked beyond. While Europe bled over land, he turned his eyes to the ocean. In 1312, he gave Portugal its first true navy, not for war, but for vision. Not a makeshift fleet, but a permanent, professional force, trained and ready. He invited the Genoese Manuel Pisana to serve as the first admiral, and gave him not just ships, but the mission to protect the future. Before the discoveries, before the empire, There was a king who raised sails toward a sea yet to be dreamed, because the sea was still a mystery. But to Dom Dinis, every mystery was land waiting to be unveiled. But while the sea opened like a promise in Europe, a shadow was rising. The Knights Templar, a brotherhood of warrior monks who for centuries had protected the realm, were now hunted by those who once praised them. King Philip IV of France, ambitious and in debt, pressed Pope Clement V to destroy the Templars, and in 1312 the bull Vox in Excelso declared their dissolution. Across Europe, the Knights of the Red Cross were hunted and silenced, but in Portugal their memory lived on. Dom Dinis saw in them not heresy, but heritage. They had helped forge the kingdom itself, and now many had found shelter beneath its banner. And perhaps more than anyone, he understood that behind that cross there was knowledge. Maybe Dom Dinis foresaw the Templars' fate and prepared the ground before the storm arrived. He couldn't keep the name. He couldn't confront Rome, but he could outmaneuver destruction with brilliance. Anticipating the tide, Dom Dinis turned to Rome. In 1319, Pope John XII issued the bull Ad Ea Ex Quibus, authorizing the creation of a new order in Portugal to rise from the ashes of the temple, the Order of Christ. A different cross, a different name, but the same men and the same castles. The bull decreed that the Templar estates in Portugal would not be given to the Hospitallers, as the Holy See demanded, but instead they passed to a new order, born in Portugal under royal protection. It was a masterstroke, a silent and effective maneuver. Dom Dinis did not defy the Pope, he convinced him. He did not impose, he negotiated. And in doing so, he saved a military and spiritual structure of immense value. What Europe destroyed, Portugal protected. And what seemed like the end became in Portugal a new beginning. Dom Dinis was not just a king. He was a poet. He wrote songs of friendship, love, and satire. He joined in poetic contests, and he presided over his realm with the same art with which he rhymed a verse. In a Europe of warrior kings, there was one who wrote with feathers, and with feathers he founded schools. Culture was not decoration. It was politics. It was identity. A school of thought rose in Lisbon, founded by his hand in 1290, the seed from which Coimbra's University would blossom, because he knew that knowledge was no luxury. It was the foundation of power. And while many kings left behind castles, he left schools. He left verses. He left a language that grew like a tree. By the end of his life, the kingdom was already shaped. But tension, like roots, also grows in silence. In his final years, Dom Dinis stood against someone he never expected. His own son, Afonso, who would one day become king, who rose in rebellion against his father's rule. The conflict nearly turned to open war. And at Alvalade, father and son stood face to face with armies behind them. Portugal nearly wounded itself. But instead of blood, there was prayer. Queen Isabel, his wife, and Afonso's mother stepped between the two. She was a woman of peace. Legend says she came on a white mule, as if sent by Providence. She knelt between the armies and united a kingdom with a gesture stronger than 1,000 swords. She saved Portugal from itself. It was 1325. On January 7th, Dom Dinis closed his eyes for the last time. He was 63 years old. He had reigned for 46. He did not die on a battlefield, but left behind an entire nation as his monument. He left behind a kingdom with borders drawn and a language of its own, with written laws, with schools, with a fledgling navy, and a cross that would endure through time. He left behind the Laria pine forest and the idea that the future begins with a seed, and a people who, even without seeing him in the squares, would still live in the country he had planted. Dom Dinis was not the end of a reign. He was the seed of a nation, and the shadow of his tree still falls over Portugal.